You're in the room. You're present. You're responding. You're saying the right things at the right moments. And from the outside, everything looks fine. But inside, there is a glass wall between you and everyone else. Between the version of you that is performing this moment and the version of you that is somewhere further back, watching, waiting, wondering why you can't just be here. The people around you are people you love. People who love you back. There is no obvious reason for what you're feeling. And that makes it worse. Because if you could point to a reason, a conflict, a distance, something that went wrong, you could work with that. You could explain it. But this has no explanation that satisfies. Just a quiet, persistent sense of being fundamentally unreachable, even to yourself. Today we're going to look at what this actually is, not the surface version. The real mechanism underneath it. Because this feeling has a name and a cause, and it is telling you something specific about how you learn to exist in relationship with other people. And once you understand it clearly, something shifts. Let's sit with the experience for a moment before we try to explain it, because the details matter here. This isn't shyness. You might be perfectly comfortable in conversation. You might be the person others describe as warm, easy to talk to, genuinely present. This isn't depression necessarily. You can feel okay, sometimes even good, in stretches of solitude. And this isn't a problem with the people around you. You're not surrounded by people who are wrong for you. These are your people, the ones you chose, the ones who know you, and yet, there is a moment, it usually happens in the middle of a gathering, not at the beginning or the end, where something in you quietly steps back. Not physically, internally. You're still speaking, still listening, still performing all the social functions with competence. But you are no longer actually there. It's as if a part of you retreated to a room behind your eyes. And from that room, you watch yourself interact with people you love and feel separate, sealed, like something fundamental about who you are is not making contact with the room. This feeling follows you home. In the quiet after a gathering you enjoyed, you sit with a hollow sensation that doesn't quite make sense. You were there. You connected. It was real. But something is missing. And the self-talk that follows is specific in its cruelty. Maybe I'm just incapable of real intimacy. Maybe there's something wrong with me that no one can see. Maybe I'm always going to be this present and absent at the same time. Those conclusions feel like truth in those moments, but they are not truth. They are the story a particular kind of nervous system tells about itself when it encounters the limits of a protection it built a very long time ago. Here is what's actually happening. And to understand it, we have to go back, not to a single event, but to a pattern, a climate. The feeling of being present in a room while remaining fundamentally unreachable is not a character flaw. It is the long-term result of learning, early and thoroughly, that being fully visible is not safe. Not safe in a dramatic sense, necessarily. Not necessarily abuse or obvious neglect. Sometimes it was subtler than that. Maybe the emotional climate of your early environment was unpredictable, warmth was available sometimes, and withdrawn without explanation at other times. So you learned to not fully arrive in relational moments because full arrival meant full exposure to whatever might shift next. Maybe your feelings, when expressed openly, were consistently minimized or redirected. Not harshly, just not met. And so the part of you that wanted to share learned to stay quiet. Learned to perform adequacy while keeping the real interior somewhere safer. Maybe you were the child who held things together. The one who was perceptive and mature and didn't add to the weight the adults were already carrying. And you learned that your role in relationships was to be present for others, not to need presence yourself. In every case, the adaptation was intelligent. You learned to show up in a particular way, engaged, functional, even warm, while protecting the most essential parts of yourself from the exposure that had historically come at a cost. The problem is that you cannot selectively protect yourself from exposure. When you close the door to vulnerability, you close the door to connection. And the result is exactly what you've been feeling. You are in the room, but the part of you that could actually meet another person there, the unguarded, unperforming, genuinely present part, is still behind the door you learned to keep closed. Now let's go into the mechanism directly. The psychological structure underneath this experience involves something called the authentic self and the adapted self. The adapted self is the version of you that learned how to function in your environment. It is skilled, often genuinely capable, frequently warm and engaging. But it is a performance in the technical sense, not fake but strategic. Shaped around what was safe to show rather than what was real to feel. The authentic self is the part that remains unperformed. The part that holds your actual reactions, your unedited responses, your genuine emotional experience of any given moment. In people who grew up in environments where authentic expression was risky or unrewarded, these two selves become separated. Not split in the clinical sense, just far apart. The adapted self goes out into the world and functions very well. The authentic self stays back, watches, waits for conditions that feel safe enough to emerge. Here is the metaphor that holds this most clearly. Imagine your authentic self is a person who has lived for a long time in a house with the curtains drawn, not because they're unhappy inside. Not because they don't want contact, but because the few times they opened the curtains, the few times they showed themselves fully, something uncomfortable happened. Someone looked in at the wrong moment. Someone didn't look in when they were hoping they would. And so they learned to draw the curtains and communicate through a narrow opening instead. People on the outside can see that someone is home. They can even have real conversations through the gap. But they cannot see the whole room. And neither, over time, can the person inside fully remember what it felt like to have the curtains open. This is the loneliness, not the absence of people. The absence of full contact between who you actually are and the room you're physically standing in. So what actually changes this? Not a single insight. Not a decision to simply be more open. Because the adapted self didn't form through a decision, and it won't dissolve through one either. What changes it is a series of small, carefully calibrated experiences that teach the nervous system, slowly, through evidence rather than argument, that full presence is survivable. Here is the framework. The first step is learning to notice the moment you step back, not to prevent it. Not yet. Just to notice it. There is a specific moment in most social interactions when the shift happens. When you move from being genuinely present to performing presence, it's usually triggered by something small. A shift in the emotional temperature of the room. A moment where you started to say something real and then redirected. A flash of feeling, vulnerability, longing, irritation that you smoothed over before anyone could see it. Your practice, to begin with, is simply to catch that moment, not in real time necessarily, that comes later, but afterward. In the quiet after a gathering, instead of sitting with the hollow feeling and making it mean something about your character, ask, when did I step back? What was happening in that moment? The brain cannot change patterns, it cannot observe. Observation itself, the act of noticing without judgment, activates the prefrontal cortex and creates a small but real moment of choice between stimulus and response. That gap is where everything starts. A real-life example. After a dinner with close friends where you ended the night feeling that familiar distance, you replay the evening. You notice it happened around the moment someone asked you how you were really doing. You gave a fine answer, a managed answer, and you stepped back somewhere in the giving of it. That observation is not criticism. It is information. And information is the only thing that creates genuine change. The second step is practicing micro moments of genuine disclosure, not vulnerability as a performance. Not sharing your deepest wounds with people who haven't earned them. Small, real, unmanaged moments. The difference between a managed response and a genuine one is often just a few words. Managed. I'm good. Just a bit tired. Genuine. I'm okay. Honestly, it's been a strange week and I haven't quite found my footing yet. Second response is not dramatically more vulnerable. It is marginally more real. And that margin is exactly where the nervous system learns new information. The brain's threat assessment system, the amygdala, evaluates new behaviors not on logic but on outcome. When you offer a slightly more genuine response and the world does not end, when the person across from you responds with warmth or recognition, rather than the dismissal or discomfort your nervous system anticipated, the threat assessment updates. Slightly, incrementally, but it updates. And over time, those incremental updates accumulate into a different baseline. A real-life example, in a conversation with a close friend, instead of deflecting a question about how you're doing with your usual competent summary, you say something small and true. Something like, I've been feeling kind of disconnected lately and I'm not totally sure why. The friend leans in, asks more. The conversation becomes real in a way that the managed version never could have been. Your nervous system takes note. Next time, the step toward genuine disclosure is slightly less effortful. Visual, 2 figures. Closer now, a small gap remaining but diminishing. The third step is building a relationship with your own interior. This is the foundational one. The one that makes the others possible. Because you cannot share what you cannot access. And many people with this pattern have spent so long in the adapted self that they have genuine difficulty locating what they actually feel in any given moment. Not because the feelings aren't there, but because the habit of overriding them became so automatic that it now operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. The practice here is deceptively simple. Once a day, not in public, not in the context of any relationship, ask yourself what you actually feel right now. Not what you should feel. Not what would make sense to feel. What you actually feel. And sit with the answer without immediately evaluating it or translating it into something more acceptable. The neuroscience here is clear. Interoception, the ability to accurately perceive your own internal states, is a trainable capacity. It is not fixed. And it is directly correlated with the ability to form genuine emotional connections with others. You cannot make contact with another person from behind a wall you can't see. Learning to locate yourself, to know what is actually happening inside you before you curate it for the outside world, is the foundation of everything else. A real-life example. Someone who has felt emotionally numb for years begins a simple daily practice of checking in, not journaling, not meditation, just a 60-second pause to ask, what am I actually feeling right now? At first, the answers are vague. Fine. Tired. But gradually, more specific sensations emerge. A low-level dread they hadn't consciously noticed. A warmth toward someone they hadn't acknowledged. The interior becomes more legible. And as it does, so does the capacity to bring it into contact with another person. The fourth step is allowing yourself to be witnessed without redirecting. This is the hardest one. Because the habit of the adapted self, particularly in people who are warm and genuinely interested in others, is to Redirect attention outward at the exact moment it turns toward them. Someone asks how you are. You answer briefly and ask them a question back. Someone compliments something real about you. You minimize it or turn it into a joke. Someone creates space for you to be seen, and you fill that space with something other than yourself. This redirect happens so fast most of the time that it doesn't feel like a choice, but it is a choice. A habitual, automatic, deeply practiced choice, and it can be interrupted. The interruption is not comfortable, initially. Allowing yourself to be the subject of attention, to be asked about, and to answer genuinely without immediately deflecting will feel exposing in a way that is almost physical. That discomfort is not evidence that something is wrong. It is evidence that you are doing something your nervous system is not yet familiar with. Stay with it for one breath longer than feels comfortable. Then 2. The brain learns that the exposure is survivable only by surviving it. A real-life example. A close friend tells you that they've noticed you always seem a little far away in group settings and asks if you're okay. Instead of your usual quick reassurance, "Oh, I'm fine, I'm just quiet," you pause. And you say, "Actually, I do feel that way sometimes. Like I'm watching from a slight distance." I don't completely understand it. The friend doesn't recoil. They nod, they recognize it. And something small but real moves between you. That is contact. That is what you've been missing. And now you know how to move toward it. Here is the model that holds everything together. You are not someone who is incapable of connection. You are someone who learned to protect the part of yourself that connects. The adapted self you built was never the enemy of intimacy. It was the guardian of the part of you that once needed guarding. But the loneliness you feel in rooms full of people you love is the adapted self doing its job so well that the authentic self, the part that could actually meet them, never gets to come forward. The path back is not a dramatic unmasking. It is a series of small, careful, imperfect experiments in being slightly more present than you were before. Noticing when you step back. Offering one real sentence instead of a managed one. Learning to locate yourself before you try to share yourself. Allowing for one breath longer than is comfortable. Someone you trust to actually see you. Each of these is small. Each of them is survivable. And each of them is a message to the part of you that has been waiting behind the curtains for conditions that felt safe enough to emerge. The conditions are not perfect. They never will be. But they are safe enough. And safe enough is all that was ever required. The loneliness you feel in rooms full of people you love is not evidence of a broken self. It is evidence of a self that learned very carefully to stay protected. And that self, the real one, the unperformed one, has been here the whole time. Waiting not for someone else to find it, but for you to stop leaving it behind. You don't have to arrive all at once. You just have to take one step further into the room than you did yesterday. That is enough.